What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Human Predator Pack Mule Podcast. We have another Q&A show for you today, and we're going to cover two questions this time instead of just one. So the first one, I got a question about power training for hunters. What should that look like? We're going to cover that. I think some of the answers are going to surprise you as to what I think specifically about power training for hunters. And the second thing is the second question is transitioning from late season hunting into a strength rebuild and long endurance running. This specific person wants to talk about strength rebuild and then getting into prepping to run ultras. That's a pretty big task. The value, there's going to be a lot of value in that question for everyone, regardless of whether you want to do that specific thing or not. But the organization of what I'm going to talk about when we get to that question is going to be huge. So stick around for that. So let's jump in with the power stuff. Power training. One of the issues that we run into with, especially in hunting fitness, because it's such a young, the fitness industry is relatively young, but it is such an young aspect of fitness. Like, it's pretty much just started. And so you look at the decisions, what people want to do. They think about, how does this specifically help me as a hunter? Which is a fair question to ask. But the biggest thing we have to ask first is this a sound aspect of training that affects me as a human and helps me move forward as a human? And the reason I say that is because we all have basic human abilities that we need to have, we need to maintain, and we need to develop. And thinking too much about, like, how does this affect me as a hunter will cause you to miss the forest for the trees for a lot of time, in a lot of different respects. And so because the industry is so young, people think too specifically about training directly as a hunter. And training is something that we have to do from a general perspective and then narrow into a more specific perspective as we prepare for specific things. And I wanted to say that because expressing power is a basic human ability, and it's something that we should all develop. And yes, is it going to help us as a hunter? But you got to keep in mind, like, most of our lives we aren't hunting, right? But we do sit around a lot. We have our modern conveniences, and we lose some of the things that we might otherwise have had if, we were living a couple hundred years ago, or even longer back, but we're not. And so training for power is something that humans need to do so we can remain powerful. One of the biggest reasons is it helps coordinate your nervous system. Being able to express power means that signals go from your brain to your muscles and back up and your joints and all of the different aspects of your nervous system that communicate back and forth. It improves that. It makes it more efficient, and that makes you a better mover regardless. It also helps you understand where your body is in space more, and it also helps improve your strength, because power and strength are on the same spectrum. One simple way to think about it is that power is strength expressed quickly, right? And so they exist on the same spectrum. They feed into each other. So developing power is going to make you stronger. But it's really a basic human ability. Like, we should all have the ability to skip. We should all have the ability to sprint efficiently. We should all be able to likely run a mile. And we should all be able to get our body into and out of good positions and have our joints function as they should. Power is just a basic human ability that we all need to train and maintain. And so really what I want to change is the way that people think about this in the hunting industry. It doesn't have to be the specific thing. It needs to be a general thing that builds raw materials that allows us to do the specific thing that we love to do. Now, there are different aspects of power, some general, and there are some specific things that we do to help with hunting. But I want you to think about what has to happen when you generate power. And first of those things is you have to have stability close to your spine and your core. And that's all the core stuff that people might talk about. But if you're not rigid here, if you don't know how to get rigid and generate force, it's going to be difficult to express power. Same thing is with landing and redirecting force. Like, that's also part of power training. And that's one of the general things that we do. So we do, honestly, for us, we jump, we throw, and we do a lot of core training to help express power, and as well as mobility training. Those, if you look at like our basic setup most of the time throughout the year, is we have a power block before we do our strength block. So you're going to do a jump or a throw, sometimes a jump and a throw, or some kind of upper body plyometric or a lower body plyometric, a core movement and a mobility movement, because all of these things coincide. The stiffness of the core training helps transfer the force of what we're doing with the power training, and the mobility training helps us get into a better position to do all of it, right? And so that's what a basic power section of one of our workouts looks like. And we do that from a general perspective, right? But there are some specific things that help with hunting. And I want to talk about two terms first before we get into that. First is extensive power training versus intensive power training. So extensive, think about a lot of reps over time. And intensive, think about trying to jump higher or use more weight for a power exercise. The intensive stuff is more general, but what we do with the extensive stuff is where we get more specific. Because if you think about one of the things that we have to do when we hunt is we have to cover a lot of ground. And that means a lot of stress on our feet and our lower legs. And we want to make them more resilient. So doing low intensity, extensive power training with things like plyometrics, we do something like, even jumping rope. We do things called rebound jumps, which are going off and on of a low plate for a bunch of reps to start to build the resiliency in our feet and our lower legs, but also improve our quickness and our agility. Because think about things that are going to happen when you're out hunting and you're moving through the mountains. You might have to jump from rock to rock, something you might have to do. And you're without a doubt going to trip at some point, and you're going to have to catch yourself. And so having resilient feet and lower legs helps prepare you for that and limit the amount of injury that you might experience, but also allows you to do it well and not get injured and be able to make that jump and be able to land and redirect yourself. And so those are the big things that we think about when we come across with powers. Like intensive is going to raise our power and our strength potential. Extensive stuff is going to help make us more resilient as we hike and cover a lot of ground, both so we can perform it and also to help us with our injury resilience, right? I'm checking my notes over here. The other thing that we need to think about is the more powerful you are, the more efficient you are, and there's less energetic cost to whatever it is that you might be doing. And so that's one of the things that we talk about with relative strength. Relative strength is your strength that you're able to express relative to your body weight. The higher your relative strength, the lower the cost of any action that you might take. So for example, every step is going to cost you less because it's less of your maximal strength output to take that step. Power plays right into that too. So the more powerful you are, the less energetic cost. By default, your endurance is going to improve. Now, I'm not saying like if you just get really relatively strong and powerful that's all you have to do to improve your endurance, but that is one aspect of the equation that will make you more efficient and help you save energy as you move through the mountains. So power training for hunters mostly needs to be general good power training. You need to be able to jump, you need to be able to throw. Sometimes we get on the bike and sprint. Sometimes we sprint, we do hill sprints and stuff like that in our programming, but a lot of it should look general. And then we have specific things that might look like things you might have to do when you're out in the mountains. So bounding would be one of those things. We do skater jumps side to side because you might have to jump from rock to rock. And we do the extensive plyometrics year round at a low intensity to keep that, to keep our feet, ankles, and lower legs healthy and resilient, and also help us to redirect force when we need to. So to recap all of that, it's a basic human ability. We need to train to be powerful because it helps to coordinate the rest of our body, helps us as movers, helps our strength, and helps our resiliency. Another thing that we have to keep in mind, it is the first thing that goes as we age. So it's not going to be your strength that goes first. It's not going to be your aerobic endurance. The first thing that goes as we age is our ability to express power. So if you want to maintain your longevity, and I've looked at the stats on this podcast, most of the people that listen and most of the people that tune in are about my age. I'm currently 38, so most of our listeners are in our late 20s to their mid 40s, and you're all in the same boat that I am. We're aging, we're not old yet, but if we don't train to maintain these abilities and develop them as much as we can right now, when we get to the point where we're older, we're going to have a bad time, right? And so training for power now to maintain it as a basic human ability is going to not only improve your endurance and your resiliency in the mountains, but it's also going to improve your longevity and allow you to do all the things that you love to do for a longer time. Okay? So that is power training for hunters. If you hear that and you're like, man, that raises some specific questions for me, please respond to this podcast. Shoot me a DM on Instagram at humanpredatorpackmule, or shoot me an email, todd@humanpredatorpackmule.com, and I will answer your questions on a future show, or I'll shoot you an email back or a DM back and answer your questions for you. But if you have more questions related to that stuff, just shoot them over. I gave a pretty good overview of why power training for hunters and how we apply it in Human Predator Pack Mule. So if you have more on that, just shoot over your questions and I'd be happy to answer them. Now let's talk about this transition from late season hunting into a strength rebuild into long endurance running. So the first thing I'm going to say about this is if you trained consistently throughout the season, which I think most of us can, right? Like unless we're a guide or we're a professional hunter or something and we have to, like we're in the field all fall, we have enough time to maintain our strength and maintain our base level of conditioning. So I don't know that we should all need a strength rebuild. What we would see, not necessarily a max strength rebuild. So if we do enough strength training throughout the season, we will maintain our relative and our max strength. The issue is our strength endurance and our strength capacity might tank because we're just not training as often. So really when I think about a strength rebuild after hunting season, I'm thinking more about strength endurance. We just used our strength endurance as we hunted, as we hiked in, as we hiked out, as we packed in, as we packed out. Those are all strength endurance events. And so we used it, and that will help maintain some of it. But to really get that capacity back and to build it into something more for whatever you want to use it for, that's what I really think about. Because at least our folks, we do enough strength training during the season that we shouldn't be losing a bunch of strength as we go through the season. So the training block that we do during hunting season is a strength focus because we think about everything else that we might be doing during the season. So we're going to be out rucking essentially because we're packing in and packing out. We're going to be hiking, whether you're an upland hunter, you're a backcountry hunter, or whatever. We're going to be on our feet a lot. And so our aerobic capacity, we definitely pay attention to it, but we shift more towards training for strength and maintaining some of our high intensity conditioning because we're going to be doing so much out in the field. Now, we have everything built into the program from strength to aerobic capacity training to the high intensity training, all of that stuff, because everybody's hunting season is a little bit different. Some people are going to be doing more hunting, some people are going to be doing less. So we include it all so people can make the appropriate choice from them and get guidance from us to do the right thing for them at the time. But that's all to say, for most of our folks, they're strength training enough that they're not going to get weaker during hunting season. They might just lose some strength capacity and some strength endurance as it is developed in the gym and doing in training. So but to get back into, like, if you know that you lost strength, a simple way to approach it is just to do the big exercises. So squat, bench. We don't do a whole lot of we don't do a whole lot of barbell bench pressing. We do some dumbbell bench pressing. But squat, deadlift, some kind of press, some kind of row, and load them relatively heavy. The reason that we talk about those kind of bilateral movements, so bilateral is both limbs at the same time, unilateral is one limb at a time. And when we're talking about strength, building actual maximal strength, we want to use bilateral lifts because they recruit more muscle mass and they require more drive from the nervous system, and you can just use more weight, so it's going to put more on you. The exercise selection, the biggest things that are going to be big strength movers for you are going to be deadlift and presses. Deadlift because they recruit the most muscle mass of all the exercises, and there's a strong grip component which has a higher recruitment from the nervous system. Now, you can't handle the same volume with deadlift as you can as other exercises. That's why it's great for building your overall strength. It's not always great for putting on muscle mass, and I talked about that in the last episode of the podcast. But truthfully, I think a lot of hunters worry too much about getting bigger and maintaining muscle mass. I'm actually going to be doing some stuff some content coming up about why I lost some weight, why I lost some muscle mass to help me with my endurance and help me with my hunting. But deadlift, press, push, pull from both your upper body and your lower body. So deadlift, a squat, a press, and a pull, and doing those every week with relatively heavy weight. We're talking about from 6 reps down to 2 or 1 reps, progressing from week to week. So a simple setup could be something like, we use an undulating setup. So we don't typically just go linear progression. So a linear will be like sets of 6 on week 1, sets of 4 on week 2, sets of 3 on week 3, and sets of 2 on week 4. Or typically we keep the same rep scheme for a month. So a linear progression for a training phase to training phase will be sets of 6 in month 1, sets of 4 in phase 2 or month 2, and sets of 2 in phase 3 or month 3. We do it a little bit differently. So what we would do is we would do like sets of 4 in month 1, sets of 6 in month 2, and sets of 2 in month 3. We've found that undulating progression helps give people better results. It also keeps us from just layering on intensity and intensity. That break and that lift in intensity by increasing the reps during the second phase tends to keep people from getting beat up too much. So that's one of the ways that we approach it. But that's all to say, like, if you want to do a strength rebuild, focus on some bilateral movements and lift relatively heavy. And we gauge intensity by reps in reserve. So that means how many reps do you have or should you have at the end of the set. And we keep, when we're trying to build strength, we keep it somewhere between 2 and 4 reps in reserve at the end of the set. So that would be something like, if you're doing sets of 6, 2 reps in reserve would be you have 2 reps left at the end of a set. And so you would use a weight that you could have done 8 reps with, right? And if it was 4 reps in reserve, it's a weight that you could have done 10 reps with. That having that buffer keeps you from overtaxing your nervous system and leaves the resources for you to adapt to your training. You don't need to be maximally lifting all the time to build strength. You can stay in that sub-maximal zone and build appropriate and appreciable strength, right? So a setup like that is going to help you rebuild your strength. Now, as you come out of the hunting season into transitioning into off-season training, we start to think about capacity. We look at strength capacity and strength endurance and start to rebuild that. And we look at aerobic capacity and aerobic endurance and start to lay our big base for the next year of training. The volume, the intensity, all of that kind of stuff depends on testing, and it depends on training history. So I think one of the best things that people can do is test and see where their weak point's at. Are you having a hard time with your aerobic capacity and keeping your heart rate down and recovering? Did your strength actually tank? Do you need to do some strength work? And then how are you moving? Do you need to really address some mobility concerns? So I think the biggest thing that people can do as they transition out of in-season to off-season is get some data, get some understanding of where you're at. We test mobility, we test strength, and then we test aerobic capacity and high-intensity output in a few different ways. And that gives us the snapshot that we need to say, hey, here's the program for our backcountry ready members. Here's the program. Here's how we think you should walk through it based on your testing, and then help people make the right decisions and guide them through that process to the best of our ability and for them to be successful. And so I think that one of the best things you can do is just get some data. When it comes to that, volume and intensity is going to be relatively dependent on the individual. Like I said, what's your training history? What's your current status? Like, so for some people that'll come into our first off-season training phase, they will do some high intensity work based on their testing. It could be because they've been with us for a long time, or they're just fit enough to be able to do some high intensity work in the early part of the year to maintain the adaptations that they've built and to start to improve their fitness, while we also focus a lot on aerobic capacity work, which would be your zone 1 and your zone 2 work. There are going to be other people that come into this off-season training phase and they're just doing low intensity work because we looked at their numbers. Maybe their heart rate recovery is not very good. Maybe their resting heart rate's too high, and maybe they just don't have the output that they need to really be able to manage the high intensity work. So they'll do lower intensity conditioning the whole time. It really depends on the person. and what the testing says. When it comes to strength work coming out of the season, like I said, we do our best job to maintain our strength. Now, our first phase, we're going to do some heavier lifting, but the goal of our first block of training is to build our strength endurance and our strength capacity so we can layer specific abilities later in the year as we get into the summer, into the preseason. And so we're looking at things like eustress training, high intensity continuous training, and tempo training to build our fast twitch and our slow twitch ability to do a lot of work is really what we're trying to do. I think an easy way to say it is the first training block of the year should be really focused on building general work capacity. And you do that by improving how well you move, increasing your movement capacity and your movement skill. The second thing is improving your relative strength, which we've done a lot of in season, so we don't need to worry about that so much. But then your strength endurance and applying your ability to use that strength over time with multiple reps is going to be huge. Excuse me, and then our aerobic capacity. You put those things together, you build a great general work capacity that we can go and get more specific with as we get closer to the season. So that should be someone's focus as they transition out. Now, if you're looking at what does volume and intensity of aerobic work need to look like, especially if you're somebody that's getting back into running and you want to get into long endurance stuff, you're going to look at like a 5 to 10% increase in volume each week. Somewhere in there is going to be the sweet spot for most people. Some people can jump to that 10% jump in volume, and I like to measure volume typically by time more than anything else because it's the easiest thing to measure, and it's the easiest thing to use to moderate your intensity. So how much time are you spending doing your aerobic work in the early part of the year? Bumping that up by 5 to 10% each week gets you into the range that you typically need to be to develop yourself aerobically. And then also, especially if you're running, I think the biggest thing is starting off, if you especially having your running volumes tanked, is keeping the volume, keeping the intensity down as you start to raise the volume. Because if you start running too hard, too fast, you're going to end up in a pretty shitty place. Now, you're going to hear folks like, I think Coop from, I can't remember, one of the ultra coaches, is he goes very general to specific like everybody else. So he has people do more intense running stuff early part in the year as they get ready for races later in the year. Here's the thing. A lot of the people that he works with already have that base and can manage that. But if you're a hunter and you're coming out of hunting season and you haven't been running that much, I would not recommend jumping into some of the intense running like lactate threshold or VO2 max type work without doing some slower, lower intensity running first to build your volume back up. So I would look at, aerobic development takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and getting your aerobic capacity back up is going to take some work, somewhere between 4 to 8 hours a week for most people. We have some people that are only doing 3. It works. Even if you're only getting 2 hours in, you're going to get better. But optimal is somewhere between 4 and 8 hours in the correct heart rate zones to really start to improve your aerobic capacity. So thinking of those numbers of where you can start and where you likely need to end up, and then creating a plan that walks you up by 5 to 10% throughout the course of the early part of the year. Now, you might build for a few weeks and break for a week, right? So you might walk up by 5 to 10% for 3 weeks, and then on the 4th week back down, and then start to go back to where you left off and walk up again. I wouldn't recommend doing it linearly. You're going to need to build breaks in for yourself too. But the goal overall is throughout the course of the training phase and the train, which would be a month, and then the training block, which would be 3 months, is to walk that volume up to rebuild your aerobic capacity. And if your testing says so, or if you've maintained a decent amount of running volume, where you start to build in some of that intensity. Intensity, I would start from a longer duration intensity and walk down to more intense after that, because first of all, it's going to be easier to manage the volume. Second of all, that's the better for adaptation for your heart and how your heart's going to contract to do the work too. So longer duration intensity like a lactate threshold, then walk it down to a VO2 max type workout, and then go from there. But all of this depends on, like I said, where you at right now physically. your training time, and what do you need? Like, what do you have available to you to be able to spend time on training, and what is your main goal? And that's what you got to think of. But for the most part, transitioning out of late season into the early off season is going to be about making sure we're moving good, rebuilding our strength capacity, really focusing in on where is our aerobic capacity and improving our base. Now, I know what I said about hunting season is we're out moving and doing a lot of that stuff, so we don't necessarily focus on that type of conditioning, but you might not get as much volume with that as you need to continue to build. So as we come off of this, we want to think, all right, we want to improve our fitness from 2024 through 2025. We need to improve the amount of aerobic work that we can handle and that we can do. And so that's why I'm saying, like, it's going to be more of an aerobic capacity rebuild and a strength endurance rebuild than anything else. Okay. Again, as it goes with the power training, if that raised more questions for you and you want to ask something more specific, please respond to this podcast. Shoot me a DM on Instagram at Human Predator Pack Mule, or shoot me an email. And like I said, I'll answer your question in a future episode on a social media post, or I might just email you back and have a conversation with you like that. And you know, if you want to have some, I'm happy to hop on the phone with some of you if you have detailed questions. But we got to, I think, what we need to do to get the general gist of these questions and what to do with power training for hunters and how to transition from late season hunting into the early off season and starting to build with if you want to get into something like a longer endurance run. Really think about the time, increase your volume, monitor how your body is handling that running. I'm speaking specifically to you guys that want to run. As you do slight volume increases, but I would really, especially if you've taken some time off of running, I would recommend staying towards the low intensity aspect of the chart and build slowly 5 to 10% over a handful of months, and then see where you're at and how you can handle some intensity as you add it in. That is all for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Before you go, check the show notes. We have a free guide called The 5 Biggest Backcountry Training Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. They're common mistakes from rucking to strength training to mental skills that people just mess up and they don't need to mess up. And if you avoid these issues, you're going to be much better prepared for hunting season and honestly, in a lot of ways, life. So the link for that is in there. Again, it's a free download, which also puts you on our newsletter list. I email 5 times a week with killer tips, with stories, and a lot of useful information that can help you with your training and with your hunting. And so that's all for this episode. I appreciate you stopping by, and I look forward to hearing from you.